Hey folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut EP from the band Syndrome, titled Colourful Cows. Now, as I've mentioned a few times before, I have taken requests to review albums in the past, mostly during times when there's nothing really coming out and I need something to review/rant about. This month, however, I wasn't planning on taking on any requests for reviews, mostly because September is an overloaded month for me, and I'm going to have a hard enough time covering everything I want to cover without keeling over from exhaustion. But I'm going to make an exception here, because for the first time in my career as a reviewer, a band has actually approached me directly and asked for me to review their material. And you know, at first, I was really flattered. It's one of those moments which is kind of nice when you read that they approached you because they value your critique and analysis, or at least they said they did. But then I got this sick, sinking feeling in my gut, mostly because talking about a pop star who I'll likely never meet or who will never contact me is a lot different than talking about an unsigned indie act trying to get their first break. And as fun as it can be to rip some shallow, studio-produced crap to shreds, it's a lot harder when you know that this work might be a labor of love that they put a lot of effort into, something that they want to share with the world, and something that has a message behind it. Now, of course, I'm also keenly aware that I might just be getting used to build free buzz for the band, or at least get somebody talking about these guys. And so before I accept the task of this particular review, I made it very clear to the band that I wasn't about to pull punches here. I'm not going to coddle them or act as free positive press. I'm a critic, and I'm not going to have my integrity compromised, no matter how independent the source. But at the same time, I do want to see people with their passion for their art succeed, so this review is going to be structured a little bit differently, instead framed as a series of questions that this band will inevitably face from labels as they try to get themselves signed. These are the questions for which they're going to need answers if they want to have any hope of success. So, with all that in mind, let's talk about the band Syndrome and their EP, Colourful Cows. So here's my first question. What genre is this music? If you can't immediately answer this question, you're going to be shown the door no matter what. And when it comes down to an actor like Syndrome, there doesn't seem to be much of a clear answer. If I were to hazard a guess based upon their instrumentation, I'd argue it could be considered some blend of electro rock and progressive metal, with a hazy and distorted guitar work, forceful drumming, and abundance of electronic elements. And for the most part, individually, these elements work decently, particularly the solid piano work and the occasional good moments from the drums. And I will say that occasionally the sonic collage that Syndrome are trying to create does have a certain unique quality to it. Frankly, there's a lot going on in these tracks in terms of instrumentation and production. But in my opinion, it's way too much, which leads to my first big problem with this EP. Yes, there are some beautiful moments that, when taken on their own, sound very pretty, but there's little to no transitions and even less control on the mix. It's overproduced in a bad way. There's so many elements that clash with each other on a sonic level that the tracks become cluttered and confused, mostly because there seems to be very little volume modulation between the elements and little restraint in the production. The electronic elements are the ones that feel most glaringly out of place because they don't often feel well integrated into the song, instead just slathered on top of the mix with little coherency. It sounds a lot like they were trying to imitate what Arjen Lucanson did on his Arion and Star One albums, and man, does it backfire in a big way. And for an act that appears to pride themselves on the construction of their songs, it's a little distressing that the overloaded mix was deemed the right artistic direction. Now this takes us to the vocals, and I will applaud Syndrome for recruiting a fairly decent vocalist. He's got energy and some charisma, and thus I really wish I got a chance to hear more of him within the mix, as his voice can occasionally be swallowed up by the electronics and layers of reverb smothering it. If I was the head of a record label, the first thing I would do when presented with this EP was to bring the vocalist more towards the front of the mix to better hear what he's trying to sell so goddamn hard. Of course, had I done so, I probably would have dismissed the EP outright, which will lead to my second question. What is this EP about? Syndrome does have an answer to this question. It is, to quote, "the first part of a story about the colorful cows, a metaphor to our life and society." Now, grammar problems aside, keep in mind that openly political music rarely sells well and probably hasn't produced chart success since Green Day's American Idiot in 2004, but what I want to focus on here is the first part of a story. Now, to me, this is like approaching a publishing company saying that you have the first 3 chapters of your novel written and that you want to get that published now, even though it's not a complete story. And that takes me to my next big issue. This album, if it is telling a story, does not feel self-contained. It feels very much like a fragment of a bigger work and left me saying, that's it? at the end of the listen. There's no arc to this EP, and while I realize that in a more singles-driven music industry that album coherency isn't as important, but Syndrome is trying to make an electro-prog rock metal album, and that genre still works in album statements. And that's putting aside the other big factor in political albums that I mentioned back when I was reviewing Shaking the Habitual by The Knife. The message you convey is only as effective as the manner in which it's conveyed, which takes us to the songwriting. And I'm going to have to be very blunt when I say this, because for me, it was the immediate death blow for this EP. The lyrics are amateurish at best, and for the most part, the technical songwriting is pretty much worthless. Forget lyrical flow, there's barely a coherent rhyme scheme here, and the lyrics feel leaden and stodgy with no real poetry or grace in their delivery. I felt like I was being lectured to. Of course, there is that one main metaphor that gets repeatedly referenced, the conflict between the colorful cows and the pigs. And I sat back and nodded, and I'm like, yep, I've listened to Nine Inch Nails, and particularly Year Zero Two. What else do you have? The other major problem that rears its head here is that by only bringing together a fragment of the story, Syndrome really don't have much else to show us on this EP. And that takes me to my final question, and the harshest one of all. Who is the market for this album? It's a question that no artist ever wants to answer. Speaking as a writer, it's always the most terrifying thing to analyze your own demographics. But it's a sad reality that most art does not always have universal appeal, and that means you need to know your demographics. And since Syndrome have limited their market by their sound and their message, they'd better have a damn good answer to that question. Now, and even if they do, let's take this a step further and analyze the conflict between the obvious heroes and the colorful cows and the pigs. Now, the breaking point of this metaphor for me is the fact that they're both herd animals, cows often being led around by a ring through their nose. Is the story of Colorful Cows then ultimately that both sides are unwitting cattle queuing up for the slaughter, being ground down by the machine? I don't have a problem with the EP ending on a downbeat note, don't get me wrong, but I get the distressing feeling that Syndrome's interpretation might not exactly be in line with mine, and mine's fairly basic. Many real critics will come to this conclusion fairly quickly, which becomes a problem when you're working with broad strokes and a serious dearth of additional nuance. As it is right now, I get the feeling that my interpretation is going to be the common one, and that's a real problem if it runs contrary to theirs. And either way, since I'm only listening to a fragment of the story where the lyrics are all basically set up and no payoff, I have very little in the way of additional context to which I can interpret this. And really, not a lot of interest to look for more. So, in short, Syndrome's instrumentation either wants to be Porcupine Tree or Ayreon, and their subject matter wants to be in line with Trent Reznor. And yet the songwriting and production can't match either. Coupled with the complete lack of memorable hooks or distinctive instrumentation, and the fact that this album is only the first piece of a non-self-contained story, and we have an act that doesn't move me at all in the slightest. On the strength of this EP alone, I would have difficulty justifying the signing of Syndrome to any label, even despite their possibly unique song construction and production techniques. As it is, Colourful Cows by Syndrome just isn't worth your time, particularly since Hesitation Marks by Nine Inch Nails just came out and is several steps better than this. I would recommend that you skip this. And as for Spindrome, I'm going to speak directly to the band for a second. Well, look, try to take the comments I'm putting forward as ideas for your improvement. I like the fact that you're trying to be political and play with some big ideas. You just need to find a way to make those ideas compelling and well-realized and preferably self-contained, and you'll have a real hit. Just trust me on that. So yeah, if you'd like to like and subscribe, I know it's kind of a downbeat note, and believe me, I wasn't a fan of having to deliver this sort of review. But if you'd like to see more, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.